We're going to show you how to relocate the ignition kill wire in the VG400 engine, specifically on this roller. What you'll see here is on the Vanguard engines, this is your ignition kill wire that runs out from underneath the blower housing and can be pinched between the blower housing and the engine block from the factory. So we find that if there's issues with the engine shutting off or issues starting where there's intermittent or no spark, this wire gets pinched between these 2 points. The solution for this is to relocate this and reroute it up over the top of the carburetor, which we'll show you how to do in the next few steps. The first step in the process is to tilt back the rear firewall so that you can get access to the blower housing bolts on the back of the engine. The easiest way to do this is to remove the top side bolts on both sides and loosen the bottom and tilt the firewall back. And you do this with a 13mm socket and a 13mm wrench. The wrench on the back side to hold the nut, remove the bolt, and then loosen, you don't have to remove, but just loosen the bottom bolt. And if you do that on both sides, it allows you to tilt the firewall back so you can get access to the bolts on the blower housing without fully removing the firewall. You can remove the whole firewall if you want to, but it's generally easier just to tilt it back so you don't lose its position. The next thing we're going to do is remove the air filter housing so we have access to reroute the ignition kill wire over the top of the carburetor. Start by loosening up the bolts that hold the air filter element top on and the air filter element in place. Once these are loose, you can pry this up, remove it, remove the air filter element. This makes it a little bit easier to get at some of the bolts you need to remove the air filter element housing. Then the next thing we're going to do is pull the choke spring off. So reach down here with a needle nose pliers, get a hold of the choke spring and pull it off, being careful not to let it spring back and fly out of the area. Now that we've got the spring or the choke spring off, we're going to try to take off the air intake and air filter housing. We start by taking a 10mm deep socket and take off this first nut, and adjacent to the throttle lever we take off a bolt. That takes that first panel and loosens it up, which then you can pull off, being careful not to lose the hardware. We take the same 10mm socket and we take the next set of nuts off of the carburetor studs. And that leaves us with one last bolt on the top back side of the air filter housing. We typically need an extension to get up in and reach this bolt. So take an extension, come in the top here, it's 10mm again. You find it right here kind of in the center of the air filter housing. Break it loose and unscrew it. Which then frees up the entire air filter housing, so you can disconnect the crankcase breather and pull the entire air filter housing off, giving us access to and visibility of the ignition kill wire and its connection point. Now that we've got the air filter housing off, we want to loosen up the bolts that hold the blower housing on. We don't want to take them off, or I don't recommend you take them off. I just recommend you loosen them up. That way you don't have to restart the threads when you're putting it back together. So what you're looking for are these little bolts here. There are 5 of them around the blower housing, and you just want to loosen them up so there's maybe a 1/4 inch of thread sticking out. So there's one here, there's one down below the housing in this area. It's kind of hard to see on this engine, but you can pull the hoses away to see it. There's one up top here, and there's one over by the starter, and one down below on the right hand side of the engine as well. I find it easiest to get at these blower housing bolts using an extension, universal, and then an 8mm socket on the end. So for bolts like this one on the top here, you need the full extension and universal joint to help get at it. There's others on the bottom, or like on the carburetor side or the starter side, that you can get at just with a deep well socket. You don't necessarily need the universal joint or the extension, but you break them open like this, back them out about a 1/4 inch on all 5 of them, just like that, and then the blower housing will be free enough that you can reroute the wire. So these bottom blower housing bolts can be a little tricky to get at. The way I like to do it is come in around this entrance hole for the hoses behind the firewall like this with my extension and my universal joint. Get it on this bolt kind of just like this. You can then break it loose. See the socket down in there, right? Break it loose. Loosen it up about that 1/4 inch and leave it. Okay, here's a view from the starter side. As you can see, I've loosened up the bolt above the starter already, and I'm moving on to the bolt below the starter at the base. Similar to the other side, I've got my extension U-joint and 8mm in through the hole for the hoses and the firewall. I'm going to break it loose, back it out that 1/4 inch, and I'm ready to go. Okay, now we've got the blower housing loose, so I can pull that away, actually wiggle it a little bit. Now we're going to try to get to rerouting the wire. First thing I'm going to do is unplug the spark plug wire and pull it down out of the clips, which you can see loosens up the ignition wire. Then I'm going to unclip the ignition wire from its ground spot, and I'm going to pull it down. You can see there. I'm going to run it around and underneath the spark plug wire to the left of it. This allows it to slip up and get around the spark plug wire. And then I want to, as I'm doing that, it's really important that you get that up in there. I'm going to take this wire and I'm going to pull it up back here around the carburetor. I fish it. Okay, so I'm rerouting the wire behind the carburetor. I use a needle nose to get in here and help kind of fish it around. And I want to get it back up behind this linkage, on this side of the linkage. So I reach in with the needle nose and I pull it up back behind this linkage. It usually takes 2 hands. You kind of have to push it through with your right hand and then pull it through with your left. Okay, so now I have the wire pulled through, but it's not routed completely yet. As you can see, if I look down in this area, it's still next to the carburetor here, right? I want to get it back around the carburetor and away from that blower housing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this way with the needle nose and then use a screwdriver or another needle nose and push this wire in around. The point being is I want it to get so that it's not coming around the carburetor. I don't want it to come around the carburetor and up. I want it to come straight out of the blower housing and up through this hole. Okay, so now I've got that wire rerouted, and what you can see is it's not going around the carburetor, it's coming straight out of this hole between the cylinder and the blower housing inside of there. And there's some extra slack on it now. You'll feel when you get it out from around that carburetor, you'll feel that extra slack pull out, and you'll know you have it routed directly this way. This prevents any pinching between the blower housing and the engine block or cylinder head. Okay, last step with the ignition wire is to pull it back around and slip it into this grounding clamp again. So just push that in, push it down, and make sure it's crimped in there good so that won't come out. And then make sure your wire routing is, like I said, up over the carburetor and like this. Once you get that set up, we can go ahead and retighten all the bolts for the blower housing using that same 8mm socket with the universal joint and extension. Go around and retighten all of those and torque them to M6 standard torque, which is a Okay, I'm done retightening all of the blower housing bolts and torquing them to 108 inch-pounds. And I'm going to reinstall the air filter housing. Start by sliding the housing onto the carburetor studs. Don't forget to push the crankcase breather hose back into the hole in the valve cover. Make sure it's sitting in there flush with the rib. And then take the two nuts that came with it, run those down and torque those to 108 inch-pounds as well. After the two carburetor stud nuts are installed and torqued down, then we need to install the bolt here in the top that holds the air filter housing down. You have to start this by hand, or you can use a needle nose to get it in the guide hole that's there. Start it by hand and then run it down with a 10mm socket, again going to 108 inch-pounds of torque. Now that I've got all the bolts securing the air filter housing down, I'm going to reinstall the cover plate. So the cover plate goes on the inboard stud, slides in, take the last remaining screw, start that on the carburetor stud, and then take the bolt, which should be the longer of the two bolts, and put it in the guide on the upper right hand side of the cover plate. Start that, run those down, and again torque them up to 108 inch-pounds. After that plate is installed, you can go ahead and reattach the choke spring. Simply do this using a needle nose pliers. Grab it from the bottom, pull it towards you, and clip it around the bolt here, making sure it stays in that down position. And we're done with everything on the air filter housing. You can just reinstall the air filter element and the top that goes with it. Okay, after we're done reinstalling the air filter housing, or the air filter element and the top that goes with it, we want to reattach the spark plug wire. So go ahead and clip that onto the spark plug, come down here in the bottom and push that spark plug wire up into the retaining clips underneath the carburetor adapter here, just to keep it up and out of the way. Okay, and then the very, very last step of this whole process is to tilt that firewall forward again and insert the bolt that we took out earlier. Slide that in there, put the nut on the back side, straighten out the firewall and tighten these up, you can torque these to 22 foot-pounds.